Rosalynn. Welcome to the Q&A Cafe, to our guests here at the Georgetown Club, to you at home or on YouTube or whatever it may be. I'm very happy to have you here, and our guest, Kate Andersen Brower, and her book, First Women, which I assume all of you have, and if you don't have it, you should get it. It's a riveting read, and we've got so much to talk about. We started back in the green room, and I said, no, wait, save it for when we get out to our seats. But I think before we talk about the unique society of women who have had this job as First Lady and the possibility we may have a man in that job, I just wanted to talk a little bit about you, Kate, because you are now a very successful author, but initially you were a White House reporter, correct?
That's right. I worked for Bloomberg News. I covered President Obama's first term, and I came up with an idea for a book called The Residence, which I wrote that came out last year, which was about the butlers and the maids of the White House. And I came up with this idea because I was on maternity leave, actually. Our son was born in 2012, and I was watching Downton Abbey. And it was, 3 in the morning, you wouldn't sleep, I'd be watching Downton Abbey, and it made me think, who are the real people who make the White House run, and what is the closest thing we have to, the British aristocracy. And really, the White House is the closest thing we have. So I went and tracked down a bunch of maids and butlers and ushers, and that was just
presumably
such a fun.
All formers, right?
Yes, although one was a current butler who spoke to me, which he was not supposed to.
I'm sorry, what?
He was not supposed to talk to me. So I didn't want to get anyone fired.
Right.
And I didn't. The White House wasn't happy that he talked to me, but he wanted to talk about his family. 9 generations of his family had worked at the White House, and they're not really supposed to talk to the press, but no one had asked most of them. And that are there confidentiality agreements they have to sign? Is it not that, legally bound? Is this just a gentleman's agreement, so to speak? It used to be. It used to be a gentleman's agreement. I don't know if that's changed now, because I know that they weren't so happy.
What's the penalty if you speak? Just ostracized by the family?
No, actually, I know that. So I interviewed Barbara Bush and Laura Bush and Rosalynn Carter for The Residence, and Barbara Bush really liked it. The Bushes came off looking very good, because all the staff said they loved Barbara and George H.W. Bush. They were so kind to them. So I don't think there was any ostracizing of the staff afterwards.
But the Bushes, and I think this comes across in this book, and I'm sure it did in The Residence, the Bushes, among modern first families, came into the White House with the comfort with having household staff.
They did.
They were used to it.
Yeah.
Both 41 and 43.
And I think that makes a difference, right?
It does make a difference.
Yeah,
I'm sure Jackie Kennedy had that experience also. But before we get a little more into that, when was the first time you went to the White House?
Probably to sit in a pool van during
you remember it? You remember walking into the White House for the first time?
No, because a lot of it at the beginning was a lot of grunt work as a reporter. So it was really sitting in, you're sitting in a van for like 4 or 5 hours while the president plays golf. It was that kind of thing, and that was how I first got into.
How about into the Residence?
I never have been in the Residence.
You wrote a book called The Residence, and you haven't been?
They never invite anybody there. Really, the Obamas, Valerie Jarrett.
Did you ask for a tour?
Oh, yeah.
But no?
No. Valerie Jarrett is probably one of the, I interviewed White House staffers who've never been in there. It is a very private place. Now, the Bushes would occasionally invite reporters for off-the-record meetings in the Residence.
So you can see it.
Yeah.
Well, you go to the Christmas party?
Yeah, but that's not the Residence. I've been on the state floor of the White House a bunch.
Okay, but you've not been upstaiz.
Yeah, the Residence is the 2nd and the 3rd floor, where the bedrooms are.
You're speaking the lingo, I'm not.
Sorry, okay, yeah, I have been in the White House a bunch. But I would love to see their bedrooms, that's the stuff that you really want to see. That's hard to see.
Little out-of-school story is that years ago when the Fords were in the White House, through my friend David Kennerly, who was his photographer, I was working for CBS at the time, and I was over visiting David in his office, and he said, "Hey, let's go over and see Jack." And like that, we walked over, and the next thing I knew, I was sitting in the president's chair in the family living room area, and I had a girlfriend with me, and Jack and David were talking about I don't know what, and Jack said, "Oh, if you want to look around, go ahead."
That's the Fords, right? They were just really laid back.
Yeah, so we looked around.
Yeah, that's
We didn't
so
open
cool.
any closets or jump on any beds.
That's neat. Did you see the Lincoln bedroom?
Yeah, yeah. No, it was, I remember, I don't even know if they still have this bedroom. I think it was called the Queen's bedroom. Does that still
yeah,
exist?
that's still there, yeah. That's very cool.
Well, okay, so we know how you first got to the White House, and we know that you then wrote The Residence. What prompted the idea of The First Women?
Well, I had had lunch with Michelle Obama and about 10 other female reporters who covered the East Wing. And so Michelle Obama was celebrating the Let's Move campaign, and it was I think it was the second anniversary of this signature issue that she's taken up to fight childhood obesity. And I just remember sitting there and just thinking about, like, when we were having this lunch, and she made one comment at the lunch, which was that her husband had stopped smoking, and she talked about exactly when he stopped smoking. And as soon as the lunch was over, we all ran and filed this story, and it became a huge, big story.
It wasn't about her, it was about the president.
Yes, it was about the president,
smoking.
but she just said it kind of as an aside, and I don't think she really thought before she said it, and right then it became a big story, and I just thought, gosh, what is it like to live your life where every little thing you say is just seized upon, and they are so secretive, especially in the Obama White House.
Yeah.
It's a very tough White House, as you know, probably, to get access to.
Yeah.
And I've talked to people who covered the Bushes and the Clintons even, and it was slightly easier. So it just made me think, what is this life like for them? And I think when I was working on The Residence, a lot of the staffers would say when a decision came from the second floor, that was their inside code for meeting the First Lady wants it this way. And I thought that was so interesting, because the second floor is referring to the second floor of the White House, where the First Lady lives and works and spends a lot of time.
Well, talk about that. Talk about precisely where the First Lady and her staff situate themselves, and has it always been that way? And really, this book, I think we should point out, the book is really about modern First Ladies. It's not the history of First Ladies. And you begin with Jackie Kennedy, and you take us through 10 First Ladies up to Michelle Obama.
Yeah.
So in that period of time, where have the First Ladies called base camp?
I mean, the East Wing, Rosalynn Carter was the first Lady to really have an East Wing office, and she took it very seriously. She went there every day. She famously sat in on cabinet meetings. She was a very involved First Lady, and when I interviewed her for this book, she said, you know, I knew I would get criticized no matter what I did, and so I knew that people were critical of my involvement in my husband's administration, but who cares? Like, I was going to get criticized no matter what. I thought that was really interesting.
But didn't Hillary, you think, get perhaps more heat?
Oh, yeah.
Without anybody even having the memory that, in terms of an assertive First Lady, the first was really Rosalynn.
Yeah.
And maybe Hillary wasn't even nearly as assertive as Rosalynn.
I don't know.
Or differently.
Yeah, differently.
Yeah.
I don't think Rosalynn would never have had an office in the West Wing like Hillary did. I just
but
think
she would
symbolically.
come and sit in meetings.
She would sit in meetings, and she would, President Carter said he got sick of her going up to the residence at night with this list of things she wanted to talk to him about that were policy decisions. I mean, she was involved in the, actual Middle East peace process. I mean, she was very involved in I think that's kind of admirable that she, but
she stood her ground.
Exactly, but on the flip side, a lot of people would say that a First Lady is not elected and we don't want them weighing in, and I think that was Hillary's big problem.
Yeah.
And, the West Wing is a very cramped space, and the fact that she had an office in the West Wing rubbed a lot of people in the Clinton administration the wrong way, let alone the public, and she later regretted having that office and told Laura Bush that, which I think is
interesting. If the First Lady were an elected position, what would be the chief requirements or qualifications?
That's a great one. Of the things that I think is really interesting that people don't think about with the First Lady is they are there in times of national tragedy, and that's why when I'm working on a story about Bill Clinton as first gentleman, if Hillary's elected, and I think that he would actually be really good at some things in this purview and really bad at other things. And I think that First Ladies, after 9/11, it completely changed Laura Bush's platform. She began to get really interested in Afghan women, and sometimes the role evolves depending on history and what happens in the world. But they're consolers. They're there to kind of.
Right.
It's got to be awful to have to visit with parents of children who've been killed in shootings, and that kind of side of it, I think we don't think about as much.
You point out that the White House, the residence, the executive mansion, operates on a very scheduled, structured, way that in many ways is apart from who the occupant is. Are there any kind of meetings or discussions going on at this point of what it will mean if a man becomes the first spouse, or what they're even going to call it?
So for the story I'm working on, I did interview Milan Verveer, who was Hillary Clinton's chief of staff in the White House. I interviewed another really close friend of Hillary's, and they're very quick to say that they have a long road ahead of them and they don't want to get ahead of themselves, so they still have this primary fight.
Right.
But obviously, they're talking about it and thinking about it, and they use terms like elder statesman for Bill Clinton, like almost like he'd be this super delegate for them. He would be an emissary, and he wouldn't be pigeonholed in the way that
But within the
are.
residence, what is it, the chief usher who's head of household?
Right.
I mean, there are certain roles the First Lady has had
Yes.
that, I don't want to say are ladylike roles, but they have more to do with entertaining and social life. Will those fall to a man, or will it be restructured in a way that there will be somebody who may not even be a family member? Maybe the social secretary role becomes an even greater role of overseeing those parts of the job. I mean that's why I'm wondering if people are talking about that.
They are. I mean, I think that the East Wing is going to actually be even more, I don't want to say ostracized, but it will be even less important, because right now there's always
in
a
the
fight.
sense of what we of its prior existence.
Right. I mean, the East Wing is referred to as Guam by some of Michelle Obama's aides, because there's this battle between the men that are in the West Wing, mostly male staff, and the women are it's mostly women in the East Wing still.
And that goes back to Jackie Kennedy, though. Except that Jackie had a way of maneuvering the men in the West Wing to her will.
Yes.
You could say Nancy Reagan did too. I mean, but you point out it's in a more belligerent and kind of manipulative way, where Jackie just sort of flirted, I guess, away with them.
And Jackie was young and beautiful, and she kind of got her way through her feminine charms. Yes.
No, for better
but
or
I think
worse.
Nancy just kind of steamrolled in there. And in a lot of ways, when I interviewed Ron Reagan, their son, he said, my mom took the heat from my father. Like, she was a pricklier personality. People called her Evita behind her back, and the staff called her the Mrs. behind her back. Really nasty, because they thought she was overly powerful. And I think you can feel sort of like she kind of manned up in a way that a lot of people don't give her credit for. It's the
dynamic. I would think the dynamic of the roles relates directly to the dynamic of the marriage.
Yes. Yeah.
And we've seen that again and again and again, and it comes across very clearly in the book. But before we leave Bill Clinton, if this comes to pass, that Hillary wins and he becomes first, whatever, it could fundamentally change the role of the president's spouse going forward, whether it becomes a woman again in the future, because the apparatus of running the family side of the White House might become much more institutional and actually run by the staff.
Right, and like you said, the social secretary, Hillary will hire a very experienced social secretary, someone maybe like Capricia Marshall, or someone who's in her orbit, who's been chief of protocol before, who knows how to get this done. But you know, I don't think that it's going to change it forever, because I think that he's such an exception to the rule. He's a president.
So imagine this, just for the fun of it. So the First Lady has a chief of staff, so presumably if Bill Clinton were first gentleman, he'd have a chief of staff. Now, what if he brings in, you know, some presidential level chief of staff, you know, somebody who had West Wing experience, you know, just for the sake of argument, Podesta or something like that.
That would be crazy. Yes.
Great story, right?
It would be a great story. And I think, you know, I talked to Ari Fleischer, who was W's press secretary, and he said Bill Clinton would be really foolish to have a big press staff. It'll be important for him to lay low.
How could that? I don't know. I'm not going to make this all about Bill, but
it's so interesting. It's a way to make it very
There's nothing
kind of
about
relevant.
the way this election turns out that won't be interesting.
That's true.
Because the way it looks right now, on this day in June, it's the candidates are going to be Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, which means either Melania Trump or Bill Clinton will be in the East Wing.
I mean, I can't imagine what the tour will look like with Michelle Obama giving to Melania Trump, this woman who's, you know, criticized her husband, who she's married to a man who has questioned her husband's citizenship. And when I interviewed people about Michelle Obama, they said that she does not take this stuff lightly, the personal attacks lightly. So that'll be a strange
But there's
dynamic.
a provenance for this kind of chilly tour.
Yes.
We take you back to Jackie Kennedy with transitioning with Mamie Eisenhower. And Jackie had just given birth, had a C-section, was rather, you know, frail and weak, recovering still because she'd had a hard time of it. And her staff had, not to tell your story, I'm going to let you pick it up, but her staff had you know, gotten in touch with the White House and asked for a wheelchair. The Secret Service, in fact, had asked for a wheelchair.
Yeah.
And you tell the rest of the story.
Well, you were telling it pretty well. She had asked
your
for yeah, Jackie had just had a C-section for John Kennedy Jr.'s birth, and she asked Mamie, you know, through her Secret Service agent, asking the chief usher, J.B. West, at the time to have a wheelchair available to her for this tour of the residence. And she got there, and she was pale and weak and exhausted. You know, she had major abdominal surgery, and the wheelchair was nowhere to be found, you know, and Mamie just
Mamie had it put behind a closet door.
Yeah, and she said, well, she never asked for it, so I never gave it to her.
It was such shade of an earlier
yeah,
era.
Exactly.
I mean,
Very,
really.
right.
But that wasn't unique, because I believe it was either Barbara Bush to Nancy Reagan, or Nancy, whatever, well, help me out here.
There's like a lot of cattiness that goes on. I hate to say it, because women are thought to be catty.
That tour is like
yeah, and the tour can be very frosty, especially for women. I mean, Betty Ford, for instance, wasn't that excited about giving a tour to Rosalynn Carter. You know, her husband had lost. She was just finding her footing in the White House, really wanted to stay.
She did not want to come down, didn't she? Wasn't
yeah.
it that
yeah, she didn't want to come down. Well, also, she had a lot of, you know, at that time,
issues.
she was dealing with, you know, she would, a lot of times, you know, aides told me that she would be in her bathrobe until the middle of the day and everything. And in
because
retrospect,
she had addiction problems with alcohol and pills,
which is amazing.
She later turned into a marvelous program for others. She got sober herself.
Amazing,
and she helped many other people.
Which I think makes her one of the most influential first ladies. She was there for the shortest amount of time, and these 10 women in the book, but I think she's had the most lasting.
All of it high drama.
Yes, and I think she's had the most lasting effect because of the Betty Ford Center and that kind of admission.
But the image of her upstairs in her bathrobe, possibly having a martini, while her successor's waiting downstairs, is why, as I read this, I can't help but think of Real Housewives of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yeah.
Because really, there is so much going on that side of the White House.
Yeah.
I almost think we're at a disadvantage that it doesn't have a press room with a daily briefing every day that's live on TV.
I know, like Eleanor Roosevelt. I know. I actually did Andy Cohen's radio show, and I went to New York and met him, and I said, I thought you'd ask me which Real Housewife these women resembled, and he said I would never demean the first ladies and ask you that question. But I thought it was, I don't think it's necessarily demeaning to ask it, but they are kind of, they are very powerful.
This is a very juicy, alarming book in passages, but without demeaning anybody.
That's good.
Because they're all telling their own stories. And that was something else I wanted to ask you. Obviously, there's a trove of correspondence between these first ladies that's been preserved. By whom, where, how?
At the presidential libraries, you can find some of these folders, and no one's really, in some cases, asked for them before because they're kind of boring folders. They'll say like official correspondence between Mrs. Ford.
But they're not boring letters.
They're not boring letters. No, I mean, some of them are really sweet. Some of the letters are, I love Jackie Kennedy's letter to Pat Nixon, where she thanks her for this tour in 1971. And one of my favorite stories in the book is when Jackie Kennedy goes back to the White House for the first time. And she hadn't been back since her husband's
And that was the Nixons?
assassination.
Yes, the Nixons had them, and it sounded like one of the most touching experiences that that happened in the between presidential families.
Yeah.
But it takes you away from a lot of these ideas you have about the Nixon family.
And about politics,
And about
partisanship, you know, Republican reaching out to a Democrat in this way. And Pat and Jackie had known each other for so long.
Senate wives.
Yeah. And
not to mention opponents on the campaign
yeah,
trail,
so in 1960 they had the bitter election, and there's a great great letter that Jackie wrote to Pat where she says, you know, in 1968 when Nixon finally wins, she says, "You've been so long on this road. I hope your family is strong enough to stay together." And it's almost like a passive-aggressive little dig because she knew, you know. And she said, you know, thank God for your health and your family, because she had lost everything, you know, at that point when her husband had been killed. And she kind of, I think, was looking at politics with a sense of the disdain.
And the files even have a thank you letter written by young John to the Nixons thanking them. One thing comes across very strong, you know, there's a lot of love and loathing behind the scenes there, among the women, between the women, in their marriages, humiliations, unhappinesses that they have to just carry and hopefully won't go public. But of all of them, there's much more sadness than I expected. One thing that comes across is this, for all the perks that it has, and there are perks, it's a tough job and there's a lot of unhappiness. But I think what I felt was the saddest person is Pat Nixon.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I was lucky to get to interview her social secretary, Lucy Winchester. I mean, it's great to talk to these people who really knew Pat. And she was very misunderstood in the White House. I mean, people in the press called her Plastic Pat. But when I talked to reporters who traveled with her, they said she was so much fun. And like, once she got out of DC, and with Hillary too, I think once they leave Washington, they really open up.
Well, look at the demeaning attitude that H.R. Haldeman had toward her. I mean,
terrible.
And obviously that starts at the top, I would suspect.
They had a tough marriage, and also, I mean, with Haldeman, you know, Lucy, or Pat's social secretary, said that, you know, Haldeman would come to her and say, we need to put this piece of furniture on the second floor. I mean, very detailed things that are not the purview of the West Wing staff at all. And he would say, tell Mrs. Nixon we're doing this. And Lucy would say, we don't tell her anything, we ask her. Because I think she was really, they controlled her, and they thought that they could kind of ice her out in a lot of ways. And during the height of Watergate, they wouldn't even let her read the newspaper and things like that. They wouldn't deliver the newspaper to her.
You're sorry, you're just not really a person, you know.
But she did know everything that was going on, and she was very clued in, and she stuck by him through it all, which I think is pretty amazing.
Well, it's that suppression and repression that they have to deal with.
Yes.
And I mean, and you know, you bring it right back up to Hillary Clinton too.
Yeah.
She had to. I would say they had the most in common. And don't you say that Hillary felt compassion for Pat for having to deal with this public humiliation?
Which is interesting, because she was investigating Watergate when she was a young woman in Washington, but she defended Pat when Pat passed away, and neither Clinton went to Pat's funeral, which was really angered Richard Nixon.
But Hillary said something, was it at a staff meeting or something like that?
Yeah, she said that, you know, one of her staffers made a negative comment when Pat Nixon passed away, and Hillary said, you know, you have no idea what she went through, and really defended her to this staffer. And I think that shows kind of Hillary read a lot about the women who came before her, and she knew and also she knew a lot about the resident staff, which I think is amazing. She read a lot about, you know, memoirs that have been written by butlers. She's really into White House history. So she
did the movie The Butler get it right?
No, I mean, I think it's a really interesting movie, but it's based on the life of Eugene Allen, but it's very loosely based on his life, and all the butlers I interviewed said that he was nothing like this character.
Have they all seen the movie?
Yeah.
Were you able to speak to staff who are currently employed?
For this book, or do you mean
as household?
Household, I did, yes.
About the first ladies.
I did, yeah, I did. And you know, they told me, I mean, when they talk about Michelle Obama, the real thing that comes across is how she keeps everything very private in the residence. And one little thing she does that I think is really interesting is she asks the West Wing to put the folder of work for the president. It used to always be right on a console table outside of the bedroom. So they would see it all the time. They would see the work. And she asked them to put it in the treaty room, which is an informal office on the second floor, because she didn't want it to be, you know, the West Sitting Hall, which is a living room for the family. She doesn't want that to be a place of work. She wants things to be separate. She wants her work to be in the dressing room. She doesn't want to see work every day. And I think every parent can probably relate to that. You don't want to... wake up and have your
Right.
laptop sitting there in your kitchen necessarily.
Well, I think one of the most interesting aspects of the Obamas, and every first family has to deal with this, is the way they have so effectively protected and nurtured their family life.
Yes.
I think of them as real parents.
Yeah.
And that they put a lot of parenting first before official life.
Absolutely.
And so what is the dynamic of their private lives?
Well, it'll be really interesting if Bill Clinton, if Hillary wins and Bill is back in the White House, it'll be really interesting for the Obamas because, they're going to stay in Washington for a couple of years. And what will that be like for Hillary to have two former presidents, right here?
Right there.
And I think about like the pressure that she's going to be under to listen to them.
The media will be reminding her all the time.
Right? And if President Obama comes to the White House, what are they talking about, and what's that relationship going to evolve into?
But Michelle really, and the president too, they strive to have meals with their daughters.
Oh yeah, every day. Yeah.
They strive to go to school events. I think I was even told by Bill Plant, perhaps, that the president tries to have trips in such a way that he can he can't control every trip this way, but he prefers a trip where he can be back home in time to have dinner with his.
Yep. And they do that. I mean, the day trips and stuff are always they try to organize them so he can be back to have dinner or to say goodnight.
So isn't this one of the ironies of the White House and being a first family, is that these political families were basically during all the years where you're working toward achieving this goal, you never see each other. And all of a sudden, you can see each other much more than ever before.
You're living above the store. You know? I mean, he works in the Oval Office, so he can come home. And Michelle Obama's really been open about how she used to, he would commute to Springfield when he was a state senator and be gone for most of the week. And she was a single mom. And she talks about how hard that was. And I think that, she's, and the president has talked about, Michelle not being the kind of wife who, when you get home, offers you a neck rub, and says, honey, how was your day? It's like she's a modern woman. She had a career of her own. And I think that maybe if Bill Clinton is first gentleman, if that's even what we call him, maybe we will allow the spouses of future presidents to have jobs that are paying. But I think the biggest problem is a lot of them are, Michelle Obama, Hillary Clinton, these are lawyers.
Right.
And there's so many conflicts of interest that could come up in that kind of job.
Right.
And if you're a journalist, it wouldn't really work. So I don't know what kind of job. But maybe they could do something totally different. And we could allow it, because I do think it's a lot to ask someone to give up their job.
This is sort of a bigger, more provocative question, but you have written about the inside, the White House, and the people who live there now twice. Has there ever been talk of relocating the White House to another location?
No, not that I know.
Because it's becoming more of a prison all the time.
It is true. That's true.
And almost every single one of these ladies throughout time, and it's worse with each administration. It is such a bizarre lifestyle.
Yeah, and Michelle Obama has said, they're prison-like elements, but it's a really nice prison.
It's a nice prison, but
I can't imagine ever relocating to the White House. I mean,
you pointed out that Hillary Clinton hasn't driven a car in how many years?
Oh yeah, in more than 2 decades.
Yeah.
She's had Secret Service protection since 1992, and she says she really misses driving a car. So.
But yet you say she also used to slip on a cap and go outside and try to walk around.
Right, and walk around Georgetown.
But with Secret Service.
Yeah, behind her. And people would come up and say, did anyone ever tell you look a lot like Hillary? And she would just laugh it off.
And they're raising their children in a very unrealistic way in that regard. They don't go anywhere without security. They don't even go to a sleepover with friends.
One thing that really struck me when I was researching it is thinking about Rosalynn Carter watching Amy Carter put on a bulletproof vest. And they were in Italy, and it was right after the prime minister had been killed.
Little teeny tiny Amy.
Yeah, and Amy was 9 years old, or 10 years old, and she has to put on a bulletproof vest and with her windbreaker over it. And you think, as a parent, what would that be like to see your child have to do that? It is such a direct way of seeing the threats that you've kind of exposed them to. And I think that there's a lot of guilt tied up in that too, because it's your decision. It's not their decision to be in the White House and to and to be exposed to this life. And I think that's why the children of the White House are really hard to write about, because people want to give them that privacy.
But I can't even imagine the challenge of raising your child, explaining to them why there's always men around with guns.
Yeah.
And then in the last 3 or 4 years, we had people jumping over fences, throwing things over fences, running.
A maid found the bullet casings on the Truman balcony just a couple of years ago when someone shot into the White House, and Michelle Obama was so, I mean, anyone would be so livid about it because one of her daughters and her mother was there, and some of the staff have told me that they're really concerned about the Obamas. Like, I spoke to 2 recently retired, one head butler and one former usher, and they said that they're really concerned about the Obamas' security and any future family because they keep hiring part-time staffers, and there's a lot to save money, and so there's a lot of concern about that. One butler told me he can't sleep at night. He's just thinking about how someone could go in there. Now, you can't bring a weapon because they go through metal detectors, but their kind of clearance is much less rigid than the clearance for full-time staffers. For a full-time staffer, you have, like, your minister is interviewed, your relatives from when you were a child were interviewed. I mean, it takes months.
It's a full Secret Service clearance, right? Yeah.
And so they know that these people don't have anything, even if you ever, were involved with drugs or something, someone could use that to blackmail you. I mean, they're looking that far out. And I think that with the part-time staffers, it's a much quicker clearance.
The people who work at the White House in the household, where do they come from? Do they come from private life, military life?
A lot of them are African American.
Yeah,
a lot of them are from similar,
DC?
From DC. I mean, it's great because a lot of them, are related, and I thought that was really interesting.
It was interesting when you talk about a whole family through generations.
Yeah, 9 members of this one family, the Ficklins, worked at the White House, and they would, because you really have to trust people to come in. If someone would say, well, my nephew's looking for a job, my uncle's looking for a job, it's not something that's advertised. These kinds of jobs are really highly sought after, although they don't get paid really that much.
How many of them live at the residence?
No, nobody lives there.
there.
No, but they'll stay overnight if there's a blizzard.
They've got accommodations.
Yeah, and the pastry chef and the executive chef, they can stay there if there's like a state dinner or some big event. But most of them live in the suburbs of DC. I traveled and I would bring Georgetown cupcakes with me to their houses and get to know them.
We have them here today. Yeah.
Oh. And that was the way I got to know these people. But that book took 2 years of research. That book took a long time.
The staff too. It must be sad for the families when they leave, but sad sometimes for the staff because they've all been together in a very intimate way.
Yeah.
And then you have situations like Barbara Bush and Laura Bush. Laura Bush came in to a White House where she probably already knew people through her mother-in-law, and while her father-in-law was president.
She told me no other first lady since Louisa Adams has had that experience, and how wonderful that was, that she knew where everything was, she didn't...
How it worked.
Yeah, and the staff really likes them. And although the problem with Laura, I think, that she ran into is that she was compared a lot to Barbara Bush, who was so...
good at it, right?
So good at it, yeah. I mean, I didn't go into this with any kind of political bent, but so I asked every staffer I interviewed who their favorite first lady and president was to work with, and almost everyone said Barbara Bush and H.W. Bush. And I can't figure out
Did you ask them who their least favorite was?
Yes. Yeah. Most people said Nancy Reagan was really tough, but they always phrased it to say she was very tough, but if you did what she asked, she was happy.
Then you didn't get
You were
thrown
fine,
out.
yes. And she was a perfectionist. I mean, she wanted it to be beautiful. When the Gorbachevs came for the first state visit, she said, I want to blow their socks off,
Yeah.
And because she wanted the White House to be the symbol of American, power in the presidency. And I think there's a lot to be said for her, the care she took. For things that we think are kind of trivial, like the flowers were changed 3 times in one day.
Yeah.
And I mean, these
That was for
elaborate,
the Gorbachev visit,
The Gorbachev
right?
visit.
Yeah.
She also didn't like Reza Gorbachev. They didn't get along very well, so she really
That was a
wanted to
passive-aggressive way of, dealing with Raisa. The legacies of each of these first ladies, each has something they've left that's left a mark on the job. I think we know kind of very publicly that for Jackie it was the redecoration. But if you're going on from there, what would be the legacies of each of these ladies, like Lady Bird?
Lady Bird, I mean, people would say her beautification project, and I think she did do a lot there. But I don't know if you've seen All the Way, the HBO.
I certainly know about it.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because the play which is a great play, but it got some criticism for not showing Lady Bird as involved as she really was. And the HBO movie really backtracks a little bit and kind of inserts her more, because she was really powerful, and she would grade LBJ's speeches. He would call her up and ask, how did I do? And before he announced that he wasn't running for re-election, which was really shocking at the time, she walked into the Oval Office and gave him a note that said, remember pacing and drama, you know, to kind of remind him to speak. So it's little things. They're presidential advisors.
Yeah.
And I think that that's their biggest role.
It was interesting too about Lady Bird is that she wanted to live a very down-home kind of existence. She didn't want to be grand. She wanted, you know, she wanted simple things, a simple life.
Well, she couldn't change the White House much, which I think is really interesting too, because Jackie was so sacred. So you can't really go in and redecorate. And Betty Ford made some joke because they're in the dining room upstairs. There was this Revolutionary War wallpaper that was famously up there.
This is a great story.
Well, I forget the exact quote now, but she said something like, you know, it's very hard to sit there and eat with men.
Watch men killing each other with blood splattering in this mural that
Jackie put up.
You point out that following first ladies have to tread carefully on Camelot.
Yes. And you cannot, and although Michelle Obama, when asked about it, has said, you know, that Camelot was a lie, essentially, that Camelot wasn't real. And so that's not the kind of life that I want to live. And I think as the years go by, we have come
Camelot
to
was
see
actually
that.
created after they left the White House.
By Jackie.
By Jackie.
Yeah, to kind of help cement her husband's legacy, which she was always worried about.
And what was the enormous faux pas that Pat Nixon committed with the engraving on the mantelpiece?
There was a mantelpiece that Jackie had engraved where she said, you know, here, you know, lives John F. Kennedy Jr., you know, John F. Kennedy, and his wife, and she had the dates that he was in office. It was very sweet.
It was wistful.
Yeah, it was very. And when, unbeknownst to Pat Nixon, the White House Historical Association had decided to replace this mantle when Lady Bird Johnson was actually there. And Pat Nixon, there were headlines blaring, you know, she's ruining Camelot and all of this, but she really had nothing to do with it. So I think you see that you have to you can change the residents, but only so much, and you have to be careful.
Would Pat's legacy be grace under pressure?
Yes, but I don't really think that she's been given much. I think I would love to see a book about her, or just or a movie or something, because I do think she's such a tragic figure. And she passed away. It was, you know, Richard Nixon at her funeral was so emotional, and you see these videos. And I interviewed Richard Nixon's brother, who sounds exactly like him.
Isn't he amazing?
Yeah,
I know, and he's still ticking.
Oh my gosh, and
like
he sounds,
crazy.
It's amazing to talk to him.
Right, I agree.
But he says, you know, Pat was just a wonderful woman who would, you know, take him running on the beach and out for ice cream, because these are people who didn't have much money. And I think that that's also something she had a tragic life. She was an orphan as a teenager. Her mother died really young of cancer. It's just a very sad life, I think.
And you have a lot of that in there, which was really interesting to read. And for Betty Ford, it would be...
Oh, it would definitely be what she did afterwards.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, also breast cancer. When
being very public about it.
Yeah,
because then Nancy Reagan also had breast cancer surgery.
Yeah.
And was but by the time she did it, it was like, okay, this is what you do.
Yeah.
So Betty sort of paved that way.
And Shirley Temple Black did it first, of course, but Betty and Shirley Temple Black embraced at a state dinner and whispered to each other and had tears in their eyes. And I thought that was really sweet. I mean, I don't know what they said, but Betty's social secretary said she saw this. And I just think that's amazing, the two women who really made breast cancer something you could talk about, talking for the first time.
Which helped everybody else talk about it. Rosalynn Carter, what would be her legacy?
I think she's somebody who's really, she's still angry that her husband lost, which I think is just funny this many years later.
Yeah.
And she thinks that it was a huge mistake that Americans made to elect Reagan. And, you know, I think she's very honest. I guess her legacy in talking to her and reading her memoir and talking to aides. I mean, I interviewed Walter Mondale and a bunch of people in the Carter administration, and they said there was no secret that she didn't know.
Yeah.
She was involved in everything, and I guess
she was an assertive first lady.
Assertive first lady. I think that would be her. I mean, mental health is her official legacy. She did a lot for mental health, and she was angry that the Obamas and the Clintons didn't reach out to her more when they were working on health care.
Didn't Laura Bush have an event and not invite her?
That was Michelle Obama.
That was Michelle, okay.
And they're still angry about that, or they were upset by that. There was.
And I don't want to jump ahead too much, but we're almost out of time, and I did want to ask you this. Why are Michelle Obama and Hillary Clinton not friends?
I just think they're very different women, and it's not that they are like mortal enemies. It's just that they, Hillary Clinton obviously can't wait to get back into the White House, and Michelle Obama can't wait to leave. I mean, aides told me she's counting down the days until they can leave. So, and also, a couple of Obama aides said that the Obamas kind of view the Clintons as people who are very ambitious, power hungry, and that they see themselves as about wanting to be in power to get things done versus just for the sake of being powerful. That's their perspective. I do think that presidential aides harbor these grudges a lot more than the actual president and the first lady themselves.
Well, didn't Michelle Obama, didn't I read in the book that Michelle Obama brought a therapist in to give relationship counseling to the East Wing and the West Wing?
Yeah, right, because it was that bad. Their relationship was that bad between the East Wing
within the
within the White House.
Not even not talking about separate administrations,
they went to
but
Blair
within
House.
their own.
To have an actual meeting to discuss all these issues.
The White House staff whisperer.
Yeah, I know. I'd love to talk to that person they brought in to kind of be as like a management consultant to help them.
That
work
will never
better.
change, though, will it?
Unless, I mean, if Hillary's elected, the East Wing will I think the West Wing will be much more interested in what this presidential spouse is doing more than ever before. He won't be relegated to some...
Do you think that the press corps will ask to have a more ramped up access to the first spouse?
Absolutely. But I think that's why when I was talking to Ari, and I've talked to other people about this who aren't Republicans, but they say that Bill should be wary of that and let her shine, and really he's going to have to work hard at doing that and not have a big staff, a big press staff. That would not be a good move for him.
There has never been like a press off, not a press office, but you know how there's the press room in the West Wing. The East Wing doesn't have that.
No, I mean they do have a press secretary.
But they don't have reporters based over there.
Right.
Everybody, even if you cover the First Lady, you're still based over in the West Wing.
That's right, and usually it's women. I mean, at this, when I was covering,
has been forever.
Always women. Yeah, which is frustrating, and maybe that will change too.
Actually, once upon a time, when I was coming up, women like Helen Thomas covered the president and the first lady.
Kennedy.
And it was just and it was assumed that just because she was a woman, that you've got to go cover this event that the first lady's having. But then you also have to come back and cover the president.
But look how that worked. That was a great first lady to start your career with.
I know. And I mean, and Helen was remarkable because she could handle both. I just want to end on one thing. I'm just curious. You've done the residents. You've done the first women. Have you thought about doing the first children?
Well, I have thought about that, but I just think that people don't really want to.
It'd be a smaller book, perhaps, but I do think they have. I've only interviewed one. I interviewed Linda Bird once, and she told these incredible stories about.
I know, and that's the thing. I just don't know if people want to hear anything negative about them. I think that's the problem. I think people are interested in them.
Well, they could probably tell some nicely negative stories about others, though, that would be fun reading.
Probably true. I would love to read it.
Not that really, this is not just a negative book, but it is. It's great fun. It's summer reading. It's good reading any time of the year. It is alarming in parts. There's lots of juice and dish, but there's also lots of wonderful history, and it's a very illuminating view of just what it's like in this side of the White House that we don't hear very much about. So thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Kate. Great. Good luck with the book.
Thanks.
Get this book, read it at the beach, and we will see you soon. Thank you very much.